are listening to Rootbound, a podcast about plants for when you're stuck inside.
Ah, the smell of fresh basil. It perfects your pizza, it completes your caprese, and now it supports your favorite podcast. Basil, making pesto possible.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for listening to this episode of Rootbound. I'm the host of the show, and my name is Steve. Rootbound, if you didn't know, is the podcast about plants for when you're stuck inside, and each week I invite a guest who joins me on the show to share with us all about a plant that means something to them, and then I share with a guest about a plant that means something to me, and through this process we can all learn more about plants and learn more about each other. If you're a new listener, welcome. If you want to follow Rootbound on social media, I'm at Rootbound Podcast. And you can also visit the website, rootboundpodcast.com, or send me an email, rootboundpodcast@gmail.com. Now, before we meet our guest today, I want to talk about a word that comes into my head often when I'm researching the plants for the show. And that word is epistemology. Do you remember what that word means from like high school philosophy class? It's a very interesting word. I actually think about it a lot even outside of the plant context. Epistemology is the branch of philosophy that concerns itself with knowledge. What do we know? What can we know? What does knowing something mean? What is the difference between knowledge and belief? It gets pretty deep pretty quick when you start thinking about epistemology because you're like concerning yourself with the knowledge of the philosophy that concerns itself with knowledge. Anyway, it's very easy to get lost in that. But when I'm thinking about plants, epistemology comes up in two pretty distinct ways. The first concerns itself with, like, what really can we know about a plant in this case? And when I'm researching plants, it's pretty interesting. You know, we have the world at our fingertips now with the internet, but it's pretty interesting how quickly you get beyond what knowledge is out there related to plants. I'll give you an example. In the episode where I talked about the sunchoke, which is more commonly known as the Jerusalem artichoke, I wanted to get to the bottom of why it's called that. It's a very common name. Everyone refers to it that, even though it is not from Jerusalem, nor is it an artichoke. And I did a lot of research, and there's a lot of people saying the same answer and over again, but getting to the core of that knowledge of why this common name is the common name is actually unclear, and it's interesting that that knowledge is not something that is easily found. And perhaps it is now unknowable because of history, and that is an interesting epistemological quandary, and I often find myself in that position when researching plants. Like, what can we actually know about a plant can be quite a struggle. And then the other way epistemology comes up when I'm talking about plants has to do with the epistemology of the plants themselves. It's very interesting to think about, what does a plant know? Can a plant know something? What does knowledge mean when it comes to a plant? You know, there's things that plants do that could be considered knowledge, like a plant knows to grow towards the sunlight, or does it know to grow towards the sunlight? Is that knowledge? It's a very interesting question, particularly, you know, humans and the animal kingdom, we're pretty different from animals and insects and things like that, but in some ways there's a lot of similarities, but plants are this whole other thing, and trying to put your mind into the quote-unquote mind of a plant and what a plant knows is a pretty interesting thing, and I find myself considering that a lot when I think about plants. And I think our guest today has some things to share that are related to this about, you know, our relationship with plants, and it's a very interesting conversation, so let's meet our guest now.
It's an epistemological nightmare.
Hi, Isaiah. Welcome to this episode of Rootbound.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Do you have a plant to share with us today?
Yeah, it's actually very interesting. So I'm a huge forager. I got into it a while back in life, and I do fungi, plants, and identification of animals. And one of the most interesting plants of living in the East Coast was the Forsythia flower. It's a very unique plant, and I was around it in my neighborhood for a few years, and it would always bloom during the early spring.
Cool. Yeah. Okay. So let's describe it a little bit. I think I know it's yellow. The flowers are yellow, right?
Yes, yes.
Awesome. Okay, that's the one I was thinking of. Yeah, it's a super cool one. So I live in Northern Virginia. I think, as I recall from your timeline, maybe this was in New Jersey. Is that right?
Yeah, in New Jersey, actually.
Cool, cool. Yeah, it's a really stunning plant. Maybe you can describe it a little bit more for the audience.
Yeah. No, absolutely. So it's I think it's a genus of a flowering plant from the olive family called Oleaceae. Maybe mispronouncing that one wrong,
Yeah,
but
those are always tough.
yeah, it's mostly native to Eastern Asia, but there are some native ones in Southeastern Europe. So, of course, through colonization, these plants have resided in the United States today. But there's this very unique component about the plant because they only produce their flowers in early spring before the leaves, and these like bright yellow flowers also have they produce this like unique substance. I think it's called like it's lactose almost, but the lactose only occurs very rarely in natural sources other than milk. So that's what kind of makes this plant and this flower very unique, is that it's a very rare one that lactates on that end, that you would say.
Interesting. That's super interesting. And well, you mentioned a little bit with foraging and stuff, but maybe we can get into a little bit like why you chose this plant. Like, why is Forsythia meaningful to you?
Yeah, I think Forsythia was very meaningful for me because during the winter time in the East Coast, and I'm originally from Los Angeles, so when I moved very few years back to the East Coast, I suffered with severe seasonal depression, which is something that I think many people can probably relate to, that the seasons in the East Coast can be a bit brutal. And of course, they're getting warmer because of climate change. But a lot of people can agree that, everyone that cannot really go out to walk because it's either very cold or you have snow on your driveway. There's just so many issues. And so when I started to live in New Jersey, I started to recognize like when the seasons were coming. And it's actually pretty interesting because as someone that grew in the West Coast, we don't really have seasons per se, but we have more like in the East Coast, you can see like, oh, the leaves are starting to fall. That means fall is going to end soon. And then in the winter, you have that. And I think with spring and winter, it's kind of a painful experience because as you're going to spring, it's still cold. And so
Mm.
when I would see these bright yellow flowers starting to bloom, that was the first flower in my neighborhood that was starting to bloom. So I said, okay, spring is really, really close around the corner.
Very nice. That has been a little bit of a theme on the show. I grew up in California as well, in San Diego area, and a lot of people have had on the show. I think when you grow up in California, yeah, you really don't like you learn about seasons in school, but it's not something that you get until you've lived, somewhere that has seasons. And so, yeah, it's a whole thing. Very interesting.
Yeah, no.
What about foraging Forsythia? Like, how do you do that? What are they used for? Tell me about that piece.
Yes, some interesting history that I found out about Forsythia is that during the Victorian era, which is like centuries ago, flowers obviously had these special recognitions of like secret language that would be assigned to it, and the Forsythia's name or its secret language that it had was called anticipation. And the reason why it was called anticipation is that in some mythology and pagan cultures, is that when that flower began to bloom, it meant that there was still at least 2 to 3 more snowfalls to expect before spring finally came. And
Ah.
so there's this legend in a lot of ancient cultures and ancient history is that Forsythia is also connected to the four elements, which is earth, air, fire, and water, and has this very unique diagram of itself. So for me, I think I recognize that flowers, and someone that's into herbalism too, is that flowers can easily be used to make flower essence. You can make syrups with flowers, and you can also slightly eat them for edibility, right? So of course you wouldn't want to eat like bunches of them, but the flower part is what makes it edible, not so much the stem or the greenery out in the outer area of the flower.
Interesting, interesting. And so you harvest the flowers, and then what do you do with them?
Yeah, so if when I would harvest the flowers, I would take my basket, and walk down the neighborhood, and I think my neighbors would see me and they'd be like, "Oh, he's foraging," and so basically, once you get the flower, one of the things I always recognize from indigenous cultures and indigenous wisdom is that you always thank the plant, you always thank the flower, and you pick respectfully, not get everything in bunches. But basically, what you do is you get them onto your kitchen table, you let them dry out a little bit, and then you prepare your solution for the syrup, and that usually requires like some sugar water, and then you having some slight syrup, and then like you can either add some maple syrup to it, but you want to boil the flowers first. So
Mm,
in a lot of herbalism courses, they teach you that the reason why you would either heat up the flowers or put them in a pot with sugar water is that it obviously absorbs it, like removes away some of the toxicity, or sometimes in this case it actually lets it become stronger
mm,
smelling, and it activates the essence of that flower. And so it's funny because when people think about syrup, they're thinking, oh well, this flower is going to produce this very thick syrup like maple syrup or
mm-hmm,
honey, for
mm-hmm,
example. But
mm-hmm,
it's actually not. It's a very liquidy substance. And if you see like different types of syrups that exist, like using lavender or like rose hips, they're all liquid because the flower itself isn't the syrup it has inside isn't a thick substance.
mm-hmm,
So it takes around like a day or two to prepare it, because once you have it boiled, you want to put it in a cup, and then you want to leave the flowers inside so it still absorbs. And then you want to let it cool down because you don't want to put it in your fridge instantly, because
mm-hmm.
that can cause a disaster. So then you let it sit out for the whole night, and then you put it back inside. And I think one of the things that makes it harder for anyone that does local foraging is recognizing that the reason why a lot of forage goods go to waste very soon is that there's no preservatives. There's a lot of unique properties, kind of like you have your own produce, right? So you have to take care of it. So they only last for like maybe a week or two in your fridge, if it's in the refrigerated time.
Very, very interesting. On the note of syrup, this is an interesting thing. I'm there's a guy who has a podcast called Wild Edible World. I think he goes by Edible Illinois on
Oh,
Instagram. Really, really cool.
yeah.
I had him on the podcast a while back, but he was saying on his Instagram that I think Mike is his name. He was saying on his Instagram that there's actually maybe two different spellings of the word syrup. We call everything SYRUP, but then
Yeah.
there's SIRUP. And
Yeah.
his argument is that SIRUP is more accurate to be called the syrup from a maple tree, which is produced by boiling the sap of a maple tree. And
Mm,
SYRUP is the syrup we make from making sugar and fruit juice or sugar and flowers. And so we've kind of like mashed them together in like modern usage, but I think originally there was like kind of a distinction in spelling to like define them. But interesting, both maple syrup and not this is one of those things that like I learned because I've actually made my own syrup. I've talked about it in an episode a while back. I have a maple tree in my backyard,
oh,
but
dope.
both syrups, the stuff doesn't normally come out of nature in that thick variety. All of that stuff has to be concentrated, and so like with
Yeah.
maple syrup, you got to boil it for like hours and hours and hours to get it thick. And same thing with like these simple syrups. Like the flour is not going to give you that stuff that's thick enough to put in your pancakes right away.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting that you said that, because I think the syrup and then syrup or however it's
Yeah, right.
pronounced,
Yeah,
that was meant to say it comes directly from the tree bark or the inside the tree, versus
yeah,
syrup is, yeah, like the flower petals that are extracted on that end, and it does take a lot of time to actually boil that water to get it to the right temperature. I mean, like it's like kind of like if you were to use like any flour to make, like, example, like dandelion tea, it's like those are the things that need to be done.
yeah, absolutely. So now you have this Forsythia syrup. Then what do you do with it? What did you do with that syrup?
Yeah, I think with the Forsythia syrup, it was actually interesting because a while you know, back a few summers ago and springs, I started to really experiment with different types of syrup. So I did make lavender syrup, and I made rose hip syrup. And
Cool.
this is like obviously inspiration from like Black Forager, my great friend over there. But I started to read more about like, does it actually taste different? Because the quest for me was to actually expand my food palette and my taste buds, because I recognized that I wasn't really eating these traditional fruits and flowers that were grown locally. Like, I didn't know that you can eat certain things. So when I ended up actually making this syrup, I said, well, syrup, I can easily eat it with like pancakes, and that's something that I like to eat with. And if you ask anyone, like, I'm vegan myself, but it's so easy to make pancakes like out of scratch. Like, I don't really you buy the cardboard boxes with the
Mm-hmm.
pancake mix. I just make them already with like flour, salt, some chocolate chips, sugar, apple cider vinegar, and then you can do that. And so I think for me, I tried to use two experiments. One was like the how people make the cinnamon pancake swirls. I tried the Forsythia swirls of like trying to like have like a hint
Mm.
of Forsythia and some cinnamon, and it was actually interesting because the flavor tasted very strong in cinnamon, but you can kind of trace this like very sweet, slight sweet taste to it. And I think a lot of people, like my friends, would kind of freak out because they're like, "Oh, is that even edible to eat, or like, is that safe to eat?" And I'm like, "Yeah, it's honestly super safe. It's just water and some sugar. It's not. It's really like not that much ingredients." And I think with Forsythia, it had a very different slight taste from lavender syrup. I think like I don't know if anyone's ever had lavender syrup, but to me, it like tastes kind of more like more potent, if I could say
Mm-hmm.
it,
Mm-hmm.
and
Mm-hmm.
depending on how you make it.
Absolutely. Very interesting. Yeah, the foraging. I'm also have gotten into foraging the last few years myself, and it is funny how I think we've been conditioned to be afraid of wild things when like that's just what food is really. Like, I mean,
Yeah, it's
food
a
is
wild element.
it's just, I mean, like we've raised it in like and domesticated a lot of plants for, and that's what people mostly eat. But like it is interesting what people's reaction, and I deal with that all the time. I'm like, oh yeah, here's this weird thing, and I'm always serving people strange things that I make, and you got to give a little convincing sometimes for sure that it's okay.
Yeah, and you have to think about the ways in which we consume products, but also use it for medical purposes, right? Like I think
Hmm.
forsythia, it's used a lot too because it's mainly in Asia region. That's used in traditional Chinese medicine. I learned that like
Mm.
the shrub of the flowers is used to like treat nausea and like fever for some people. And there's like some research, very minimal that research that does exist, that it contributes to like antibacterial, antiviral, and anti-inflammatory properties
Mm.
that could help with like minor medical alignments. And I don't, I'm not saying I advocate for people to go all
For sure.
plants, but there is like alternatives to help reduce, some types of pain without if you don't have like, for example, Tylenol, right? Like, let's say you don't have money or you don't have access to that. What are some alternatives to help?
Yeah, that's a really great point. That's something I talk about a lot on the show, and it's always a little bit of a struggle of like, I definitely want to always give disclaimers to audience of like, don't just use things without understanding them first, right? But
Yes.
there's also a lot of traditional knowledge and old knowledge in all these plant uses forever. And if you look up any plant, there's always a litany of like medicinal uses. But I feel like we've, as a society, have kind of cast that aside a lot, and in some ways, then lost the true like meaning of it. And like, so it's a complicated topic when you're talking to podcasts because like you don't want to like say yes, go use this stuff, but you also don't want to discount it entirely either, right? It's
Yeah.
more complicated.
Yeah, and I think the main missions for a forager perspective, and or even an herbalism perspective, it's not to quote unquote heal your body. It's more to experience a different relationship with the flower that you may have not known of. And so I always remind people like, it's about the relationship you build versus the outcome that you're trying to get out of it.
Yeah, very very good point. It also reminds me back with the episode I talked with Nancy Ray about
Mhm.
sage and white sage, and we talked about medicine a bit, and
Oh, yeah.
and medicine in a Western context just means something you use when you're sick, but
Yes.
But in many other cultures, the word medicine means anything that helps you, right? And it's a much more nuanced and complicated word than just a bottle of pills, right? And so when people say use a plant as medicine, I feel like often there's a lot of context missing, and we simplify it to like our modern medical way of thinking when it can be broader. Like if you have a nice, fizzy drink with some Forsythia syrup and it makes you feel better, that can be medicine, even if it's not like directly interacting with some kind of medical pathway like a Tylenol does, right?
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think that's the thing where it's with anyone that practices foraging or identifying or trying to build something with a plant, it's an active place-based relationship. So that means actually understanding that when you're going into this process to extract or to make something out of it or to even smell, like you are creating a web of understanding of not so much to interrogate that system, but to have curiosity of what it can provide to not just yourself, but to the natural world.
Thanks, Isaiah, for sharing about Forsythia with me. Do you mind if I share a plant with you?
Yeah, that'd be super great.
Okay, so this is kind of a group of plants, mostly because I'm not 100% sure about the plant that I have interacted with is, and that's because it's a little bit
Mm.
complicated. So I'm going to be talking about grapes, but I'm
Oh,
not going to be
wow.
talking about the grape we all know, which is the European grape, Vitis
Yeah.
vinifera, the wine grape. That's the one all of us mostly interact with. I'm talking about what I'm just going to call wild grapes, which is kind of a whole thing. Now, when we talk about wine grapes and we talk about different kinds of wine grapes like Chardonnay or Pinot Noir, Zinfandel, those are actually all the same exact species. Those are all Vitis vinifera. They're just different varieties of the same species. But there are actually at least 79 different species of grape. So in the genus Vitis, but different species, which is super fascinating. And we have a bunch of them native to North America as well. I talked about in a previous episode about one that's called Vitis rotundifolia, which is also known as the muscadine grape, or more specifically the scuppernong, which I actually have growing outside my house,
Ah.
which is a fun episode. Go back and listen to it if you want, audience. It's an interesting one. But I'm going to be talking. Scuppernong is also grows in the wild, but it's also been cultivated a lot. But these three that I'm going to be talking about are mostly only found in the wild. There's not too much. Like you won't find vineyards of these grapes. The three I'm going to talk about, and mostly because, like I said, they're a little bit hard to tell apart. And when I found them in the past, I wasn't trying to figure out what they were. I was just like, oh, those are wild grapes. There's one that's called the summer grape. That is Vitis aestivalis, which in Latin means pertaining to summer. There's also the riverbank grape, which is Vitis riparia, which means river. And then the winter grape, Vitis cinerea, which means the ashy grape, because I think the leaves have a little bit of a powderiness that makes them look ashy. All these grapes are much smaller than like the grape we think of. You know, all the grapes that you buy at the store or use for wine have been bred for years to be super big and juicy, but in the wild, they really want to be eaten by birds, and like the grapes that you grow, you know, in agriculture are too big for a bird to get. So these are much tinier grapes. The vines can be really prolific. So the places I've seen them, they just cover huge swaths of trees, and you'll see them, and they'll just be covered in grapes. But one of the challenges with wild grapes is sometimes the grapes are like 30 feet in the air because they climb a tree, and so like
Whoa.
you really can't get them. Those are for the birds, right? You got to find the one that has got the grapes low enough that you can actually grab, which is an interesting challenge with them. I'm going to get into specifically why they're meaningful. I mean, I've hinted a little bit that I've forged them as we were talking before, but let's talk about some interesting facts about them. So there is, I live in Virginia, like I said, and Virginia has a wine country. And if you go to Virginia wine country, there is a grape that a lot of people mention called the Norton grape. It's a variety of grape. And Norton is actually a hybrid between the European grape and Vitis aestivalis, the summer grape. So it's a hybrid
Interesting.
American and European grape, which is only really found in wine made in Virginia, which is a pretty interesting thing. this brings me to probably this is a super fascinating topic, and people have probably done whole podcasts on this. I'm going to try to go quick. But does the word phylloxera mean anything to you?
A phylloxera, I mean, it reminds me of the genus names of
Yeah.
some type of plant. That's all I can think of.
It is a genus name, but it's a genus name of an insect, phylloxera.
Oh, interesting.
And phylloxera is this little tiny, almost microscopic bug that feeds on the leaves and roots of wild American grapes. And it's mostly not a problem. However, in like the 1800s, a bunch of British dudes started bringing plants back. 1800s started bringing plants from the Americas over to England, and they brought American grapes over. And with those American grapes, they brought over the phylloxera bug, unknowingly.
Yep.
And that bug escaped into the wild, and the European grape, Vitis vinifera, the wine grape that has been used for wine for centuries and centuries, had no natural protections to this insect. And because of its infection, it would end up feeding so much on the roots, and then there would be subsequent fungal infections of the roots that it would essentially girdle the roots, which means it would cut a complete line all the way around the root and just completely kill the vine. If you girdle the root, the grape is dead.
Yeah, because that's where it's connected to its life. Yep.
Exactly. And this is a whole huge thing. There was this mass epidemic of phylloxera in Europe in the 1800s and 1900s that nearly wiped out all European grapes.
Wow.
They estimate 2/3 to 9/10 of all European grapes were destroyed by this bug. And
is that species still alive today, or they lost a few of those unique species that were within the 2/3 of what was lost?
So that's a really interesting question, and I'm trying not to talk too much about the European grape because this is about the American grape, and we're going to come back to that in a second. But yeah, there definitely were some European grape varieties that were lost entirely. There was one interesting variety, I forget which one it was, that was growing in Argentina before phylloxera, and they realized, we thought we lost it entirely, but we rediscovered it in Argentina and then brought it back to Europe. So there's a whole interesting of what grapes were lost. There's a whole interesting history of what little pockets in Europe the grapes survived, because really almost, think about it. France almost lost all their grapes. Wine production just plummeted during this time. And all because of this this cautionary tale that we hear a lot about these days of human travel bringing unintended consequences and this ecological damage because we don't think things through, or things have have unpredictable consequences. And I think no one thought just by bringing this grape from the East Coast to London would unleash this havoc across this just super important industry, but it did. And then going back to the American grape, in some ways the American grape is what caused this epidemic, because this bug, which the American grapes were immune to, essentially, they created a sap in their roots and leaves that would gum up the mouth of the phylloxera and protect it from the damage. But the European grape couldn't do that. But the American grape is it's humans which caused it, but it was because of the American grape that this happened. But it's also because of the American grapes that the whole European grape industry was saved. And it's because essentially all grape production in Europe now, they raise European grape on the rootstock of American grapes. So they graft European grapes onto American roots. And so the American roots are immune, but the European grape is still growing from that root. And that's what saved the whole industry.
It's almost like it's a Band-Aid situation. A permanent Band-Aid situation to heal the scar. But it honestly, that is insane to think about, that relying on that plant in America is to bring it back, that root, to ensure that it wouldn't die, can continue living, is insane.
Yeah, it's a bonkers story. It's something I feel like, if you talk to people in the wine industry, everyone knows phylloxera. It was just a huge thing, when it was happening, and it's still, the ripple effects are still here. But we all, if you have your glass of wine and you have a glass of wine from Europe, no one really thinks about this. That almost didn't exist anymore. European wine was almost just not a thing because of this.
We could have destroyed their whole economy and become the biggest global economy for wine. Is what America could have done.
Well, true, and we still have to like worry about it though too, because California they grow a lot of grapes, but those are all European grapes, and the same thing. California grapes are European grapes grafted to American rootstock, and there's a whole industry. I mentioned how like the American grapes aren't really grown commercially. They are, but just for the rootstock. Because if you want to grow now in the modern world, if you want to grow European grape, you need American rootstock, or you need some kind of hybridized rootstock, because the phylloxera is still here, and eventually your grapes will succumb to phylloxera because it is spread around the world now. There's a few pockets here and there where it hasn't made it, but like there, I was reading just today about some small regions that for whatever reason the phylloxera never made it to in Europe, but now in the last few years it finally got there and wiped out those grapes that had survived that whole time. So, but that's an interesting thing. It's the American grape kind of was a partially part of the problem, but was also ultimately part of the solution, which is super fascinating.
Like, it's kind of like original Europeans who brought it to America and then messed it up, but then America brought it back in somewhere when there was like a disease there, and then with America had to come back and be like, here's our rootstock. It should be okay.
Yeah, it's a fascinating story of like, I mean, it's a cautionary tale, but it's also like hopeful as well, right? Of like, there is it's fascinating and complicated. So anyway, I wanted to share with that because I think it's one of those stories that some people know, but it's also, I think, not very common knowledge. Okay, last thing I want to share, which is more about why they are meaningful to me. These wild grapes. So there's this guy. Do you know about this guy Pascal Baudar or Baudar?
Were they a botanist?
He's a dude. He actually lives in L.A. I think you should follow him on Instagram and stuff. He's really into foraging, and he's really into wild crafted fermenting stuff, which is super super cool.
Love fermentation. That's a whole new skill.
Yeah, it's amazing. And he has this book I'm going to show you here, audience. Of course, you can't see it because this is a podcast. But this is a book that was super inspiring to me. It's called The Wild Crafted Brewer. And look at the beautiful pictures. I'll put a link in the show notes. It's a really great book. He has a few other books about wild crafted fermentation. But I've got into this concept of fermenting, also wild fermenting, which is using wild yeast, not store-bought yeast. I'm a beekeeper, so I make a lot of mead. I've been using the mead for the honey for my bees, and I use a process to raise my own yeast that is living in the honey already to create fermented drinks without adding yeast. It's really cool.
That's super dope.
But this book goes a step further, and man, this book is. I mean, this guy it's amazing stuff. But he has this one section of this book which he has entitled, and this kind of goes back to something you said earlier. He says this is fermenting a beverage that represents an environment. And he goes even more minuscule, but when he talks about fermenting a beverage that represents an environment, this is the steps he has written in the book. He says, 1, survey the area, 2, establish the flavor characteristics, and 3, determine the essence of a place. And so this is the idea of like, if you were in a certain forest, and maybe there's a lot of Forsythia, but there's also some wild grapes, and there's also some other things, like what are those flavor components? And then he just has a process where he puts them into a simple fermented beverage where it's either like something more like he calls it a beer, which is a little bit of a more loose definition than we're used to, or a mead.
Like the way that it would taste like in that.
Yeah, and even the taste is a little bit different. But basically you're making this complicated fermented drink that is a representation of a specific place, which is, and he talks about it as being like a hyper focused terroir. Right? It's not just the terroir of a whole region; it's the terroir of like this one forest, maybe, which is super super cool. And then he gets even a little more specific later in the book, of talking about making a fermented drink that is the representation of a hike you went on. So he's like talks about going on a hike, collecting things as you hike, bringing them back, and making a beverage from it. And now you kind of have this drink that is kind of a portrait of your hike, which I thought was super, super cool. And so that's what I did. I was inspired by this book. And so a while back, I was last September. I was on a foraging walk. There's a local guy here in the DC area goes by Matt's Habitats, and I've been on a few of his foraging walks. And we were in this area along the Potomac River, and there was just tons of these wild grapes. And I remembered this book, which I had just been reading, and I was like, I'm going to do this. So I collected a bunch of the wild grapes as the primary ingredient, but I also collected some wild ginger, which is an interesting plant around here, some jewel weed, some smartweed buds, and then one wood ear mushroom.
Oh,
yes, wood
ears, yeah.
Yeah, I put all these grapes in a jar, smashed up with all these other ingredients. I used maple syrup as the sugar source instead of honey in this case, and then I added yeast, which I cultivated from my mead. So it's mead yeast. Mixed it in. I put it in a jar. I let it ferment for about a month, and then I poured this just beautiful. I'll put pictures in the show notes. This beautiful purplish reddish. Slightly fizzy, very tasty drink that is like nothing you can find in the store. It's like, when you start fermenting your own stuff, you're like, oh, this is like something, it's definitely like funky.
Like
it's
it's true soda. True soda.
Yeah,
in
true
nature.
soda and true like, truly unique. And then I served it to, we had a party in last October, and I had a bunch of different meads and different kinds of fermented things I made, and I served to a bunch of people. But this one was everyone's favorite, actually. This one that was like this complicated, strange representation of a hike I went on in September, which I thought was super cool.
Now, that is something I want to make, and I think that would destroy the soda industry for sure.
for sure. Yeah, definitely check out this book. And yeah, I mean, you should connect with
You
this
have to
guy,
send it to me. Yeah, you'll have to send it to me because I've been really curious about processes around fermentation and trying to make my own bread or just like fermenting plants and what they would taste like, and that's a whole new landscape.
Yeah, it's super cool. And with this, I'm really interested in making these like alcoholic beverages. You can also do versions that are just more like a soda that you can, if you do it right, the alcoholic component is not there. But when you make your own alcoholic drink, it makes you think about how it was done in the past. And when it's not done in this commercial scale that is designed to be as high alcohol content as possible, you're essentially just like making something so you can preserve these ingredients, and that's what alcohol does. And like when you make something like this, like I don't even know what the alcohol content of this beer was. It was probably, if I was lucky, 4%. It could have been 3. It could have been 2. Like you have no control over that. I mean, a little bit, but that's not what you're trying to do when you're making a wild fermented drink. You're just trying to like. It's a great way to like. I feel like respect the ingredients by like merging them together in this natural process. And it's super cool. I've been really into it for the last
it makes you think that those are the natural fusions and they complement each other to be able to make a good dish. And that goes back to this idea that those plants and flowers substances that we find in the forest from their chemical properties like are meant to be together.
Absolutely. I think that was very well said, and I think it's a great way to wrap up this episode. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you again for having me.
What did the green grape say to the purple grape? Breathe, you idiot.
Well, that was just a wonderful conversation with Isaiah talking about the wild grape and the Forsythia. And before we close, I got a couple things that I want to just talk about here at the end. The first is one thing I missed in the wild grape segment I think this is pretty important, is there are a few toxic lookalikes to wild grape, and so if you're going to go out there and forage, you should know about these. Also, if you're going to go out and forage anything, make sure you consult a local expert. Make sure you are confident in your knowledge of plant identification. It's something very, very important. But in addition, there are at least 3 plants that are sometimes commonly mistaken for wild grape, so here's those plants so you know them. The first one is pokeweed. I think this one looks the most different from wild grape, but for the uneducated person, it does have these like dark purple berries. I talk about this in episode 7 of the podcast. It's a really cool plant. I like it, but the berries are very toxic and you should not eat them. But it does look quite different, so look that up. The second one is one that I haven't talked about on the podcast yet, but I'm very familiar with it because it grows in my yard, and it's a little bit the bane of my existence. It's called porcelain berry, and porcelain berries' leaves look very much like wild grape, but the berries have this kind of more like matte, multicolored look to them, and they also kind of point up instead of down. So once you recognize that, it's pretty easy to tell the difference. They're in the same family as grape, but not in the same genus. And then third, there's a plant that I've actually never seen in the wild, but it looks quite like it, particularly the berries. It's called moonseed, and like I said, I haven't seen it in person, so I'm not sure how to really describe the differences to you, but apparently the prime difference has to do with that seed. In the wild grape has several small, like oval grape seeds in it, whereas the moonseed has one crescent-shaped seed. And I think that's why they call it moonseed. So just forager beware. Those are the toxic lookalikes to wild grape. And just in general, take responsibility, learn about the plants, be in a relationship with them, and like Isaiah said, kind of examine that relationship between yourself and the plants before you begin to forage, so you're safe and you kind of gain that knowledge. And speaking of knowledge, back to epistemology, I had another one of those moments like I talked about at the beginning of the show. One thing that Isaiah mentioned about Forsythia is that it produces lactose, which kind of breezed by me when in the conversation. But as I was thinking about it later, I was like, oh, that's very interesting because lactose is the sugar that is present in the milk of mammals, and it's pretty interesting if a plant creates that. So I started to go down this rabbit hole about that, and I'm even more confused now than I was before. It's one of those things, if you Google, you'll find plenty of resources that say Forsythia is one of the only plants that produces lactose, and then you'll find other things that say Forsythia does not produce lactose at all, and that is not true, and it's a common myth. But getting to the core of where that myth came from, why people believe that, where did it come from, or is it a myth and it is true, and why people believe that it is not true is pretty tricky. I did find a reference to a scientific article from 1949 that specifically mentions Forsythia having lactose, but I found other articles that kind of debunk that, but they don't describe what it is. There's like one reference to a sugar that might be similar to lactose, but not quite the same. There is also a molecule called galactose, Ga-lactose, that is present in many plants that is separate from lactose, and so maybe there's just a name confusion thing. But anyway, I'm not clear whether or not it has lactose. I think I am clear that Forsythia is a cool plant and is an interesting plant and has lots of interesting uses. But the epistemological challenge of whether or not it has lactose is very interesting, and it's something that's hard to get to the bottom of, even when we have the world at our fingertips. So I think I'll leave you with that. It's an interesting challenge to know things, even in this modern day. But I hope you learned a little something on today's episode. And if you want to share anything with me about what you learned, please send me an email, rootboundpodcast@gmail.com. And with that, we will end the show. Thanks for listening. My guest on this episode of Rootbound was Isaiah Hernandez. Isaiah is an environmental educator and the digital media creator of Queer Brown Vegan. You can learn more about Isaiah at queerbrownvegan.com. If you like Rootbound and you want to help support the show, you can visit rootboundpodcast.com/support to find all the ways you can support the show. There's a link to the Patreon there and a bunch of other stuff. Thanks. Rootbound is hosted by the epistemological podcaster Steve Ellington. Music by Christian Kriegescota. Fake ads by David Lonnie. Rootbound is a podcast about plants for when you're stuck inside, but if you can go outside, you could make your first foray into foraging when the Forsythia is in bloom.
Basil, making pesto possible.